Let's go on to another element, the element of imminence. Imminence has to do with the requirement that the threat you're defending yourself against is either actually in progress, you're getting beat, you're getting shot, you're getting stabbed, or it's immediately about to occur. The fist is drawn back, the knife is in hand and within proximity to be brought in contact with. It can't be a past threat that's already over. So somebody threatened you yesterday. That wouldn't be an imminent threat today, although it's something you may take into consideration in evaluating whether or not you're facing an imminent threat today. It's context, but by itself, it's not an imminent threat in the moment. And it can't be a future speculative threat. So somebody says, I'm going to go home and get my gun and come back here and shoot you. If they come back with the gun, they may present as an imminent threat. But the mere verbalization of what they plan to do in the future is not by itself a threat in the moment, an imminent threat. That would justify your use of force. Here, of course, the element of imminence would appear to be satisfied for this shooter. Now, again, we're not talking yet about the intensity of force involved. We're just talking about, is he facing a threat that's actually occurring or immediately about to occur? And it doesn't have to be true that that's the case. The real question is, can he argue that he reasonably perceived he was facing a threat actually taking place or immediately about to occur? And I would suggest the answer to that is yes. I mean, he was just struck by this guy, knocked to the ground, and the guy's still standing over him. He's not walking away. He's still a threat. And a pretty good indication that someone's about to strike you now is that he just struck you a moment before and doesn't appear to be stopping. So I would suggest that the element of imminence is in this shooter's favor. What about the element of proportionality? Here we get to the question of whether or not the gun is the right answer to this particular threat. Now, as a guy who's carried a gun pretty much every day of my entire adult life, not literally every day, because sometimes I go places I'm not allowed to carry a gun. I just spent a week in New York State, not allowed to carry a gun in New York State. So of course, I didn't. But as a guy who's pretty much carried a gun every day of his adult life, I've never actually needed to use that gun or even to threaten to use that gun in self-defense. And it's my experience, and the Department of Justice crime statistics back this up, that the gun is rarely the answer to the problem you're facing. You look at Department of Justice statistics, you're 5 times more likely to be facing a non-deadly force threat in some kind of an assault scenario that would not justify your use of a gun in self-defense than you are to face a deadly force threat that would justify the gun. So guns rarely the answer. Unfortunately, when the gun is the answer, it's usually the only answer that's going to work. That's why I carry a gun. A seatbelt is rarely required when you're driving a car, hopefully. But when it is required, it's pretty helpful. And as with a gun, you don't get to pick when the seatbelt is helpful, right? You don't strap in and then deliberately wreck your car. Someone else does that. Well, if you're a law-abiding person carrying a gun for personal protection, you're not carrying a gun looking for a fight. You're carrying a gun because sometimes fights come looking for you, and you want to be prepared for that eventuality. So this guy's got a gun in hand. What would justify his use of deadly defensive force here? Well, he'd need to be able to articulate that he had a reasonable perception, not necessarily a reality, but a reasonable perception that he was facing that imminent deadly force threat. What do we mean by deadly force? Is it force that is killing you? Do you have to be dead first? No, because the element of imminence says you can defend yourself against a threat that's about to be realized. Obviously, it would make no sense to wait until you're dead to defend yourself, right? I hope we all get that. You don't have to wait until you're shot before you can defend yourself against an imminent threat of being shot. But you do have to, whatever threat you believe is imminent, has to be reasonably perceived as a deadly force threat. What do we mean by deadly force here? It's not just force that can kill you. It's force that can kill you or cause serious bodily injury. Every state has a 3-word phrase for this concept: grave bodily harm, grave physical injury. It doesn't matter. It all means the same thing. It means something more substantial than a minor injury, than bruising. It means something like, well, it would include death, of course, but it would also include a maiming injury, broken bone, head trauma, severe brain injury, blinding, loss of a limb, things along those lines. But it doesn't necessarily have to be something that would kill you. So threat of death is not required before you're privileged to use deadly force in self-defense. A threat of serious bodily injury is sufficient. And by the way, that includes things like rape. So just because, as horrible as that is, we might presume that I guess I'm not even supposed, I guess I just got demonetized on this show on YouTube. Even if the criminal act wouldn't result in death, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not privileged to use deadly force to defend yourself against that criminal act. So here, this gentleman, this shooter, would have to be able to articulate that he reasonably perceived he was facing not merely an imminent threat of harm, but an imminent threat of deadly force harm. Can he articulate that? Well, I would suggest the answer is Yes, even if we assume there's no other artificial weapons involved, because we're all armed, right? We're armed with fists, we're armed with feet. And there is some reason to suspect that this standing gentleman here may in fact be armed with an artificial weapon. I'll get to that in a moment. But for now, let's presume he's not, that he's only armed with his hands and feet. Well, fists and feet can cause serious bodily injury. Anything can cause serious bodily injury. It depends on the manner of its use, right? A little pillow that your grandmother knit with a kitten on it can cause serious bodily injury if it's used to smother somebody. The shoelace on your shoe can cause serious bodily injury if it's wrapped around somebody's neck. More people are killed with fists and feet in America every year than are killed with rifles, for example. So hands and feet can definitely inflict death or serious bodily injury. That's especially the case if, when you're being subject to attack by those fists and feet, you're on your back and the other person's standing up. They can field kick your head. They can stomp you with their feet. They can mount you like Trayvon Martin mounted George Zimmerman and beat your head into a sidewalk. They are clearly in the superior offensive position, readily capable of being able to inflict death or serious bodily injury if they sustain their attack. That's also the case, of course, if there's a disparity of numbers. So normally an unarmed aggressor, a traditional fist fight between two people of similar size, strength, and fighting ability, is going to be presumed to be a non-deadly force attack unless there's some kind of aggravating factor. One of those aggravating factors might be that one party's much larger or stronger or has an exceptional fighting ability that the other doesn't have. But another aggravating factor can be fights are dynamic, that one of the people is put in a much less defendable position, like on their back on the ground. Another aggravating factor that could make a weaponless attack qualify as a deadly force attack is a disparity of numbers attack. Very difficult for anyone to defend themselves against multiple attackers without substantial risk of death or serious bodily injury.